Dear colleagues, I don't know if it's because the cold, damp autumn weather here in Brussels reminds me of the Glaswegian summer, or if I'm just getting a little bit homesick having not been back since February. But I thought today I would talk about my home city, the city where I was born and raised, Glasgow. Glasgow is the biggest city in Scotland, and it sits on the River Clyde. The population of Glasgow and its surrounding urban areas, known as Greater Glasgow, is estimated at about 1,673,332. Glasgow is also a bit of a paradoxical city, as it's often voted as the friendliest city in the UK, but it's also been voted as the most violent in Europe. Kevin Bridges, one of the most recent kind of well-known comedians, talking about this paradox, jokes that in Glasgow you might get stabbed, but you get directions to the hospital. In reality, I'd say that the scales are definitely tipped in favour of friendliness in Glasgow. It's the kind of place where you ask someone for directions and they won't just give you the directions, but they'll actually take you to the place. And this is all summed up in the local government's marketing slogan for the city: People make Glasgow. So I'd like to talk a little bit about Glasgow's 14-year history. So it was probably founded in the 6th century when St Mungo built a church at a place called Glasgow, which means dear green place. It was a fishing settlement at first, but it gradually grew into a small town. It was given a bishop in the year 1115, indicating that it was fairly important by that time. The population was, however, quite small at that time in the early Middle Ages. There was only around 1,500 inhabitants, and the town was only made up of 4 streets. And in fact, one of the reasons for this was that Glasgow was actually on the wrong side of Scotland to trade with other European countries like Germany, Holland, Belgium, and the Scandinavian countries. But as the years went on, it grew in importance, and in fact, the wooden bridge across the River Clyde was replaced by a stone one in the year 1410. Then, in the year 1451, reflecting its growing importance, the city was allowed to have a university. Over the following centuries, it increased its trade activity, and despite being besieged several times in the 16th century, despite suffering 2 great fires and being struck by the plague in the 17th century, it continued to grow and prosper. Now, with the colonies that were being set up in the Americas and the West Indies, Glasgow was on the right side of Scotland to benefit from transatlantic trade with the so-called New World. In 1674, the first cargo of tobacco arrived in Glasgow, and tobacco would actually go on to become one of the city's leading imports. And in fact, many of the popular, now public buildings, such as the Gallery of Modern Art, were actually originally houses belonging to very rich tobacco lords. In the 1720s, Daniel Defoe described Glasgow as a very fine city. It is the cleanest and most beautiful and best city in Britain, London excepted. Now, Glasgow grew exponentially, both in terms of population and size, throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. And of course, with that came serious problems. By 1871, the population was now up to 500,000, and this was despite a very high infant mortality rate. Many people lived in horrendously overcrowded housing, and at that time, Glasgow was described as possibly the filthiest and unhealthiest of all the British towns. So that was quite a change in just over 100 years. But improvements were gradually made, especially in the second half of the 19th century, when Glasgow saw its first piped water supply. There was also a sewage system that was built, an underground railway, and even some electric street lighting was introduced. At that time, Glasgow's major industries included shipbuilding, especially on the River Clyde, of course, the cotton industry, engineering, carpet making, pottery, and glass. In the late 19th century, the River Clyde's port facilities were greatly improved by building docks and new quays. And in 1888, an international exhibition of science and art was held in Glasgow. So things were on the up as the 20th century came around, of course, Glasgow wouldn't be spared from the horrors of the Second World War, the First and the Second World War, and it would also not be spared from all the different changes which took place in the 20th century. But that's a topic for another speech. Thank you very much.